Okay. So as our first speakers, I'm really happy to introduce a couple of folks from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. As many of you know, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for recovering endangered species, managing migratory birds, conserving wildlife habitat, and maintaining the lands and waters of the National Wildlife Refuge System. So our first speaker will be Tom Melius, who serves as the Midwest Regional Director at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Tom has brought more than 30 years of leadership and vision for fish and wildlife and plant conservation across the U.S. He's the service's national lead for Monarch Butterfly conservation initiatives and is helping to ensure a future filled with monarch butterflies. Tom will be followed by, Louise Clemency, who is a field supervisor here at Chicago's field office, and she'll be providing some additional regulatory and technical updates, particularly related to the monarch butterfly, but also a couple other key species. So, welcome, Tom.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Iris, and appreciate the Energy Resources Center here at the University of Illinois Chicago for hosting this meeting. It's a great opportunity to bring all of us together to talk about habitat conservation along right-of-ways and other managed landscapes for the benefit of a number of species. As was mentioned, the Fish and Wildlife Service's mission is to work with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, and plants and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American public. This morning, I came in about 10:30 and heard a lot of the discussions going on in the other end of the room, covering a lot of the foundational information about what is going on currently with the monarch butterfly. One of the things that got the Fish and Wildlife Service involved with monarch butterfly was back in 2014. 3 years ago, we received a petition to list, or for consideration on whether or not to list the species as a threatened or endangered species. Now, our mission is not to just add species to an endangered species list. In fact, if that happens, we haven't done our job. Because one of the benefits of the ESA is that it can bring people together before a listing determination and to try to work collectively to keep that species off of such a list. Now, all of us know monarchs are in trouble. But the good news is we still have several years until June 2019 before a decision is made on whether or not that species warrants that type of protection. This morning you heard from a couple of individuals on how the Fish and Wildlife Service is moving forward with a species status assessment, how this framework is helping us through an analytical approach to make sure that we understand the best scientific underpinning of what's happening with that species and what future that this species is going to be dealing with. And one of those things in the future is how we are going to be able to restore and enhance habitat for that species through strategic planning. And you'll hear more about that later on how we are working collectively within states, how we are working collectively within regions, how we are working collectively both here in the eastern part of the United States with the eastern population of monarchs, as well in the western, across the Rockies to the west with the western population. One of the efforts I think we've heard the last year, and I heard it this morning and you'll hear it throughout this workshop, is that this challenge really needs all of us working together, whether it's urban, rural, whether it's the agricultural, whether it's working with states, whether it's working with a gardener. I think all hands on deck are needed to restore habitat for this particular species. We can't do it alone. Individually, you can't do it alone, but collectively, we can. We can work together to make sure that we have a future filled with monarchs. But it's not just monarchs. As I heard this morning, some of the questions raised about why is it monarchs? Well, Monarchs, in my opinion, is the brand. It's the hook. It's to get the public to support this effort. And this effort is supporting many hundreds of other pollinators and other bird grassland species that this habitat effort is going to be providing. Xerxes Society, Monsanto, Pheasants Forever, XL Energy. Many of you already have noticed this and are working not only individually but collectively to make our efforts be more than just on an individual basis. And that effort is going to be benefiting a lot of critters, a lot of ecological functions, whether it's better water, better wildlife, better pollinators, better for the public to work together. So the right-of-way for Habitat Working Group, I think, is on to something. This is your 4th meeting. You've bought into this, and I think you're all hoping just to understand your piece in this effort. And I'm hoping over the next day and a half, as you saw the various themes, some of those pieces will become a little bit more clear for you, and you will be able to understand, going back, just how we are all working together. You know, it's from your own backyard, the back 40, or every back road in between. I think we all have an opportunity to work collectively to bring back and restore habitat for the benefit of this species and many others. So I really appreciate the work that you are doing. And this presentation is a little bit of a tag team. So Louise, Clemency, here in Chicago, why don't you get into a little bit more of the details. But thank you very much for everything that you guys are doing.
Thank you, Tom. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. And before I start my regulatory update, too, I want to say hello to everybody. And I've worked with a lot of people in the room as a partner, or a collaborator, a stakeholder, or a regulator. And when I do have the regulator hat on, I know we've all had better and worse regulatory experiences. And the best for me are always when we're exchanging information well about what we can do. And so in this presentation, I'm going to be providing for you the Fish and Wildlife Service tools and our standards, and to give you insight into the kind of information that we'll be needing going forward. And then this morning was very valuable, and then for the rest of the session, we'll be looking to hear from you about the way that you can provide information, because I think that's always where the system flows the most smoothly, when we have a good match between the information that we require from a regulatory and species standpoint, and we can work with the industry groups in the way that you can provide your information. We find that connect between the two of them. So I'm going to provide updates today on 2 pollinator species, the Monarch Butterfly and the Rusty-Patched Bumblebee. And I'm just going to, and I have a lot of information to cover, so raise your hand if I'm going too fast. I tend to talk fast. And let's get started. So for monarchs, the challenge we have in front of us is 20 years of a declining population in both the eastern migratory population and the western migratory population. The western population we know a lot about the eastern. The western has seen a 74% decline since the 1990s. And although total monitoring effort has increased, we didn't see numbers increase, so that indicates that abundance is going down. As Tom mentioned, based on those declines, the service was petitioned to list the monarch butterfly as a threatened species in the summer of 2014. We completed a finding in December of 2014 that determined there was substantive information, but we then missed our 12-month next step to identify the status of the species due to workload that we had on a lot of other species that we were listing. So we received notice of intent to sue in January from the Center for Biological Diversity and the Center for Food Safety. We settled with them, and we now have a deadline that you're all very aware of, I know, of June of 2019 to have a draft status assessment. We call it a 12-month finding in the Federal Register. So we started a status review last May using our species status assessment framework. Dr. Voorhees talked about this a little bit this morning. We've assembled a species status assessment, which I'm just going to say once more, and then I'm going to shorten it to SSA. So a species status assessment, SSA core team which includes about 17 folks from various regions around the country for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and 2 representatives from the Midwest Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. So Karen Kincaid from Iowa DNR, and I believe Ed is here from Minnesota. Ed, are you? Yes, thank you. Part of our team for the species status assessment. We're currently moving into phase 2, which is reviewing the literature for the entire range, including all the monarch butterflies outside of North America. In summer of 2018, we plan to collect information from the states on their formal conservation efforts. And I know a lot of people in the room here too have been part of those efforts or have been reached out to by the state for some information. Oh. So what happens when you use someone else's PowerPoint? The animations get you. So what is a species status assessment? It's a framework for how we piece together the puzzle that reflects what is the conservation status of the species. It's an iterative rather than a step-by-step process. We first compile the species needs or the basic biology of the species, and then we look at the current condition of the species, and finally we try to assess what is likely to be the future condition of the species. Is it in danger of extinction in the foreseeable future? That leads to an assessment of the overall viability of the species, which we define as the ability of the species to sustain populations in the wild into the future. Kristen talked about this a little bit this morning. I know everyone wasn't here though, so I'll go over briefly. For our species status assessment, we use conservation biology principles that we call the 3 R's, so resiliency, redundancy, and representation, to try to grasp all the aspects of what makes for a species to be viable into the future. So resiliency is the ability of the species to withstand environmental variation and stochastic events. They do this by having healthy populations distributed across a diversity of environments. Representation is a term we use to represent adaptive capacity of the species. So it's got the genetic diversity that it might need to withstand future changes in conditions. And I like to think of it as both genetic diversity and the diversity of selection pressures that it's exposed to in different environments or different climatic regimes, different ecoregions. Redundancy represents the ability of the species to withstand catastrophic events due to the number and distribution of its populations. So for example, for monarch butterflies, catastrophic events we might be thinking about would be droughts that would affect nectaring flowers as it heads down to Mexico, or catastrophic winter storms, for example. So there are 3 populations of monarchs within North America: Eastern, Western, and Florida. And because it's important for monarchs to maintain adaptive diversity, I talked about that adaptive capacity, we've identified some further divisions of these 3 populations into 6 what we're calling adaptive capacity units. So places that we think, places on the map that we think represent areas that contribute to the adaptive capacity of the whole monarch population. And you can see some of these on the map up here. For example, within the eastern unit, the northern portion might provide some adaptive capacity because of the unique selection pressures up there for long distance migration, which is part of the amazing monarch phenomenon. When it comes to the ability of monarchs to withstand catastrophic events, it's going to be important to maintain broad distribution across the breeding and the migratory grounds. And we're also hoping for distribution across the wintering grounds in both California and in Mexico. So again, for example, one bad winter storm or drought couldn't hit the entire population. Similar to many species, insect species, monarchs exhibit large fluctuations in population size from year to year. They're really bouncy, which makes it hard to figure out what is the significant population trend. We want to make sure that population growth rates in the species are strong enough so that the population can recover from even a series of bad years. Harsh winters, for example. The SSA work has identified some important components to restoring healthy populations in monarchs in North America, and the next question is, how do we achieve this, and how do we reverse the trends that we're currently seeing? For monarchs, the main influence seems to be the amount of habitat and the quality of that habitat. and the distribution of the habitat through North America for the northern breeding ranges all the way down through their migratory routes down to Mexico. So as part of our species status assessment, we're going to be thinking about the stressors acting on both the habitat and the quality of the habitat in those areas so that we can make sure we see an increase in the population growth rate. So high quality habitat, and we had some conversations about this at our table earlier. We all know that milkweed is important. I think everyone in the room also knows that also important is a high diversity of nutritious nectar sources available whenever adult monarchs are present, so during their whole cycle, including the fall down into Mexico, and a reduction in insecticides for both life stages wherever they're present. And of course, we need both the wintering, the breeding habitat and the overwintering habitat to make a healthy population. Our goal is to get the population growth rate to increase to 1.5 or 1.2 over the next 50 years. These are based on some of the population models that Kristen alluded to this morning. The average is important again because the population is going to need to be able to fluctuate to high numbers in good years and then sustain successive bad years potentially and then bounce back from those bad years. Recent literature estimates that a 6-hectare overwintering population target would require an additional 1.6 to 1.8 billion stems of milkweed. These numbers, of course, are obviously based on models as well. An important note, this is additional stems of milkweed, so this is in addition to whatever we have out there on the landscape already. We'll need to maintain those acres and get additional acres. The same thing in the West, a healthy monarch population needs to have a positive population growth rate, and protecting those overwintering sites will be key, as well as protecting habitat, increasing habitat, and there's a little bit of a bottleneck between the overwintering grounds and the breeding grounds. One way to potentially reduce the overall numbers of acres of habitat needed is to increase the quality of habitat. We heard about this in one of the presentations too, is all acres of monarch habitat aren't equal. And so in the eastern population, there have been several recent papers focused on what it'll take to reverse the decline. One of those is the All Hands on Deck Scenarios paper that's currently in review. They compared various potential scenarios on how we could distribute milkweed gains across different sectors and different land types. And it's possible to get 6 acres, 6-hectare winter target, where we're going to need all the sectors. So that's protected lands, that's urban and suburban, that's agriculture, CRP land, rights of way. All of them are important in these various sectors. The states are working currently with an optimization tool to try to help allocate the acreage of conservation efforts and stay in communication with each other on what amounts everybody's pitching in and how they can reach that collective goal. This chart indicates that several sectors are necessary in any different array of getting to the goal, and with the red is all sectors are necessary. I'm going to shift gears now and talk about our policy for the evaluation of conservation efforts. And the shorthand for this is the Pece policy. It's PECE, Evaluation of Conservation Efforts. This is really important for us because this relates to something we talked a lot about in various forums this morning, which is assurances for what do you do if you're doing a great job helping to conserve monarchs now and adding lots of acres of monarch habitat, and then the species does get listed. So we'll talk about that a little bit for candidate conservation agreements. So our policy for the evaluation of conservation efforts sets out, it's a lot of pages, and it sets out a lot of criteria for how to evaluate conservation efforts, but they fall into 2 main categories. Our criteria is that the agreement that's put in place has to have a pretty high standard of certainty that the conservation efforts will be implemented. So here we're talking about things like conservation easements or escrow accounts to ensure habitat management, programmatic kinds of things. And then the other piece of this when looking at a conservation agreement is we need to have a certainty that the conservation effort will be effective. So this is the piece that speaks to research studies that tell us what sorts of planting regimes, what distance from stressors like pesticides might be needed, and that's the second key portion of the Pece effort. The Pece policy relates to the species status assessment because the purpose of the species status assessment is to describe the ability to sustain populations over time. To do this, we identify species needs and whether or not those needs for protected habitat and relief from other stressors are being met. One of the tools that we're going to need for this is to see, with all the work that's been going on the ground over the past couple years and the extra efforts that we anticipate over the next couple years, we're going to want to look at those efforts and evaluate them to say, how sure are we that they're going to be implemented? How sure are we that they're going to be effective? And if we have those two key pieces of information, then we can take those efforts into account when we're projecting the future status of the species and whether or not its needs are being met. So you can kind of see here in the species status assessment, I talked before about the first piece being look at what the species needs, but when we talk about what's the current condition and are those needs being met, conservation agreements of all kinds are going to be really important to inform that. I think during the science section I also talked a little bit about how there's a lot of different databases in development, and as the Fish and Wildlife Service, we're doing a lot of thinking about how to gather information from everybody on your conservation efforts, and we need enough information that we can rely on it to feed into this status assessment, but we're also trying to trade that off with what's information that's doable for everybody to put into a system and that is makes sense across different states and different regions and different utility sectors. So that's one of those pieces of work that we're really looking forward to having you all help us with and work with us on. And then we're also, and whether the work is ongoing or commitments for the future will be where they'll fall into the status assessment, whether it's current condition or future condition. So to gather this information, one of the things that we're talking about doing at the Fish and Wildlife Service is creating a conservation efforts database. So this would be our database to try to gather this data that I talked about with you. The sage grouse effort used a conservation efforts database effectively to gather this kind of information that they used in their determination of enough conservation efforts that they didn't need to list that species. And while we have some larger challenges in terms of sheer numbers and diversity of landowners in our range, in the monarch range, who might be contributing to monarch conservation, we're going to be building on the sage grouse work and their conservation database. We're also going to talk more about this effort in a talk later this afternoon in measuring success. So I'm going to transition now to talk about some of our regulatory tools. I heard a lot of questions drifting up about this earlier today. I'm going to talk about safe harbor agreements and candidate conservation agreements with assurances. The last thing we want is for landowners to be afraid to make habitat for monarchs because it might get listed at some point. Candidate conservation agreements are voluntary agreements, and a landowner can decide to withdraw from one at any time. But if they're solid enough that they meet our standard, our Pece policy, the policy for evaluation of conservation efforts, then they'll become a permit with assurances, and that's something that would provide comfort to the entity that's putting in the habitat now in the event we all hope doesn't have to be the case of listing the monarch. Candidate conservation agreements can cover species that we've determined qualify for listing, but other priorities prevent us from listing, or just imperiled species that are declining and could become candidates for listing. So the monarch is a definite fit for that. We talked a little bit about in some of the tables that I was at, what's the difference between an HCP and a safe harbor and a candidate conservation agreement. And this chart kind of walks you through some of those differences. So the first thing we ask is the proposed activity, is it funded by the federal government? Is it on federal land? Is there a federal permit required? If that's the case, then we use a process called consultation that comes from Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. If the federal government's not involved, then we go to the authorizing procedures under Section 10 of the Endangered Species Act, and we have to ask our next sorting question, which is the point of the activity to benefit the species? Is it just conservation for the purpose of the monarch butterfly? If the answer to that's no, then we do a habitat conservation plan, and I know there's several groups in this room that's worked with us in the past on habitat conservation plans. If the purpose is to benefit the listed species, then we go through another sorting, or if it's to benefit the species, the next sorting is the species listed or not? If the species is listed already, So for example, the rusty-patched bumblebee might be an example for this, creating habitat for that species because it's already listed. Then we would do a safe harbor agreement that would identify the positive actions that the landowner would do to benefit the species, identify a baseline, and basically give the landowner assurances that extra efforts that they did to make their habitat better for the species wouldn't result in additional regulation for them down the road. If the species isn't listed yet, then the tool that we would use would be candidate conservation agreements. Now there's another difference between safe harbors and candidate conservation agreements besides the fact that safe harbors are for listed species and candidate conservation agreements are for species that aren't listed yet, and that's that there's actually a different standard. So for safe harbors, there has to be a net benefit to the species in order to get those assurances that you could take some of the species later on. For candidate conservation agreements, it's an even higher standard actually, so there has to be a net benefit to the species. But a CCA, we must also feel that it provides enough conservation that if these actions were done on all necessary properties, listing under the ESA would be precluded. So the standard is not just it's better than it would have been, but that it's actually good enough that if other properties did this too, we'd have conserved the species to the extent that listing wouldn't be warranted. So candidate conservation agreements do have a higher conservation standard than safe harbor agreements. Just to describe that a little bit more, to issue a CCAA, we have to look at what's proposed, the threats, and the conservation efforts. And besides being a net benefit to the species, the agreement and the activities described under the agreement and the BMPs, et cetera, have to address all the threats to the species on that property that are under control of the property owner. The agreement duration for a candidate conservation agreement should be long enough to allow the species status to improve. So this will depend on generation time of the enrolled species. Primary forest species or long-lived reptiles obviously need an even longer permit duration to be able to see effects than a shorter-lived species. A property owner can decide before the duration is up that they no longer wish to participate in the CCAA. So it's voluntary to stay into the agreement, but of course once the species is listed, if the property owner or the industry group wants to terminate the CCAA, then they also lose the permit coverage that they got that came with the CCAA. Benefits of a CCAA are both to the species and to applicants who undertake a CCAA. So obviously the benefit to the species is conservation actions happen for the species, maybe more habitat gets created for the species. The benefit of the CCAA to the landowner is that if the species is listed, they already have a permit. As soon as the species becomes listed, the agreement becomes a permit that goes into effect that covers the agreed upon impacts of their activities that are covered under the agreement. And they have assurance that no additional requirements, because we've learned more about the species, for example, will be placed on them after the species is listed. I do want to share what isn't covered though is any new activities. So if you were a railroad and you had a CCAA for the activities you were going to conduct on the railroad and the species became listed, you'd be covered for all those activities. But if you were going to discontinue the railroad and build linear condos or something on that property, that activity wouldn't be covered. To receive a permit, the property owner has to address all the threats to the species on their property that they have control over. So these threats should be reduced to some extent or eliminated. And again, the trick here, why I say CCAAs have a higher standard than safe harbor agreements, is that the net result needs to be a reduction or elimination of stressors to the point where if everyone who had agreements did these same activities, then we wouldn't have to list the species. So for example, creating habitat. So this is daunting, obviously, and those of you in the room who've been involved with us on some HCPs know that they can actually be a lot of work, or candidate conservation agreements. And so one approach that sometimes saves work is if an industry sector or a region goes in together on what we call a programmatic agreement. So a programmatic agreement would involve either multiple property owners in an area or a common sector going in together in one entity that has the ability to manage those other entities would become the permit holder. And then they would hold the permit, and they would allow smaller entities to sign up under their permit through what we call certificates of inclusion. And each certificate of inclusion would go to a separate property owner, whoever controls the property. And then in the overall programmatic agreement, there'd be kind of a menu of BMPs and conservation actions that you would indicate we're going to work on your property. The programmatic permit holder is often a state wildlife agency or other nonprofit organization which takes on the responsibility of administering the regional or statewide or sector-wide CCAA, and then works with all the sub-permittees under their permit. We have an example of this. I think some people in the room are familiar with it's not a CCAA, it's an HCP, but the statewide HCP for the Karner blue butterfly in Wisconsin, where the state of Wisconsin was the permit holder and then worked with the forest industry and the agriculture and the rights of way under that to ensure that conservation all rolled up to the level that was required. The last time I presented to you, I talked about templates for CCAAs that we were interested in working on. So our team has done a lot of work in the past year over assessing what does the species need, how do we need to describe conservation efforts for monarch butterflies in a way that could go into these candidate conservation agreements. And now there's the piece of a candidate conservation agreement where each industry would describe their activities and what they would want to be covered and how they would want to report on those activities. And that's where it's really more effective for us to work with an actual applicant so that we don't dream up on our own what we think would be a good way to report. We'd much rather work with some of you. So I'm kind of soliciting, and we talked about this in the earlier section, that if there are some groups who might be willing to brainstorm with us some of these elements for a template CCAA, that would be really valuable to us. Please talk to me or Iris afterwards. So I've alluded to this, if a species that's covered under a candidate conservation agreement becomes listed, then the permit goes into effect and the property owner is not required to take any additional actions. We know the Endangered Species Program works best when we're in good communication with our partners and stakeholders, so we've established this website to take comments. So please, obviously today and tomorrow, talk to any of us if you have questions, but if you have thoughts after that you want to share on anything related to the status assessment or conservation of the monarch butterfly, we have a website where we're collecting those comments, and it's up here behind me. I'm going to transition now to the Rusty Patch Bumblebee, but I think maybe we have time for about 3 questions if there's any burning questions on the monarchs that I've covered so far. Is that okay, Iris, before I move into the Bumblebee? And we'll do this for about 5 minutes, and then we'll move on and take more questions after.
So that was really helpful because I've heard all of those acronyms a lot, and having a visual put to it was super helpful. And I don't mean to put you on the spot and you can just say, we're not sure yet, but it made me think of something like the monarch that is so widespread, so widely distributed, working with residential homeowners, for example. What would a likely mechanism be for a programmatic CCAA? I said that right? A candidate agreement for individual homeowners. I mean, would it need every single homeowner who puts milkweed in their backyard to have a certificate? Is that what you're saying?
That's a great question. That was not what I was saying.
Okay.
So we have some examples from this in other parts of the country, actually, where we've had endangered species, a beach mouse, for example, with a lot of individual landowners and some different mechanisms that we've used. We're going to have to talk and think more. I don't have an answer for you yet about the landowners. And I think for all of these, for a widespread species, we would want to come up with broad descriptions. For the northern long-eared bat is a good example where we came up with some broad categories of agreements with different sectors of how they could comply with the Endangered Species Act. So we would definitely be trying to come up with that for landowners. We would not expect each individual landowner to come to us and reinvent the wheel.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh.
On the subject of the individual homeowner, before the actual listing in any individual places that are collective is maybe significant. And I'm just wondering.
Right. And that's the challenge I alluded to compared to sage grouse, where the properties were huge with monarch butterflies, where success is going to be the collection of vast numbers of smaller parcels all adding up together. And right now I know the states are working on databases where they're going to collect conservation efforts and they're tackling different categories. So, but we haven't figured it out yet. And I'll take the EPRI gentleman.
Thanks, Louise. John Goodrich Mahoney from EPRI. So there appears to be a lot of interest in trying to help the monarch butterfly and working cooperatively with the service. What's going on in Mexico? What happens if it all falls apart in Mexico? Is the service working with the Mexican government to assure habitat down there if that's possible?
Definitely. There's a lot of work going on in Mexico as well in the Mexican government, and there's Mexican nonprofits and Mexican biologists on the ground working with their issues too. So it's on all fronts.
Okay, thank you.
So, okay, I have 2 minutes and I'll in the back.
That's a really quick question, Louise. When you say landowner, I assume you mean easement as well, correct? For CCAAs?
You know, we've struggled with this before with easements, and that is really tricky. So I think we're going to have to think about that. Yeah, I think we've talked about that in the past, where you're not the landowner, but you have some control, and I think we're going to have to do some more digging into that. And I'd love to. Yeah, I think it'd be great if that's one of the reasons why for each sector it'd be great to have a group that can help us, even if you're not willing to. You're thinking, you know, I don't want to raise my hand and say I want a conservation agreement right now. But one thing that I think would be helpful for the service would just be some brainstorming groups where they could talk about if we were going to do it, these are our concerns, this is what would be helpful for us, and then we could really dig into that easement question. Okay, so I'm going to move on to another charismatic species, pollinator species, the rusty-patched bumblebee. So this is a species that now is listed. It was listed as endangered effective March 21st, 2017, so just recently. This species was once common and abundant, but witnessed swift and really dramatic declines, and now it's only known from scattered locations, and we mean really scattered. I don't know how well from back there you can all see the locations. The gray area is the historic range of the rusty-patched bumblebee, and the current range is the red dots, and they're even smaller than they look on the map, but at this scale we had to have them that big so that you can see them. Their life history is important. Rusty-patched bumblebee colonies rely on the survival of their queen bee, who is the only member of the colony that survives the winter. She emerges in the spring from hibernation, finds a suitable nest site, and lays eggs that she has kept fertilized, that were fertilized the previous fall. Worker bees hatch and the colony grows. Unlike large perennial honeybee hives, bumblebees form smaller annual colonies, like 50 to 1,000 bees. And at the end of the season, in the fall, new queens emerge and they mate, so their eggs are fertilized, and then that new queen is the only one that survives over the winter. Rusty-patched bumblebees are habitat generalists, so they use just a whole diversity of floral resources, starting from when the queens emerge in the spring and throughout the summer and fall. The reproductive males and females can disperse long distances, so up to 10 kilometers is known, to find mates and overwintering habitats in the fall. Once a colony is established, however, with their summer nesting site, an individual bee will likely have relatively short foraging distances. Rusty-patched bumblebee nests are typically in abandoned rodent nests or similar other underground cavities. They use open areas containing nectar and pollen sources that are near their colony nest site. Other bumblebee species typically forage less than about a half mile from their nests. The rusty-patched bumblebee, though, I did mention it's one of the first bumblebees to emerge in the spring and one of the last to go in the fall, and so one of their habitat requirements is flowers that bloom throughout the length of the season, and we think the spring ephemerals flowers are important for them as well because they do come out so early. Overwintering habitat has been described only anecdotally for the rusty-patched bumblebee. From the literature, we know other species of bumblebees typically form a chamber in soft soil, and they can use compost or molehills to overwinter. The decline of the rusty-patched bumblebee, the very sudden decline, we believe to be a combination of factors. Loss of habitat, disease and parasites, which often perhaps escaped from commercial bumblebee colonies, use of pesticides that might directly or indirectly kill the bees, changes in climate, which especially they're especially vulnerable to phenological climate change because of that long range that they have in terms of the year and when flowers are up. And most likely, as with many endangered species, it's a combination of these factors that has caused the decline. So for regulation, now that it's listed, we've developed guidance that's up on our website. If you don't remember the whole long URL, you can just Google FWS Bumblebee and you'll get to this. And so we've got a range, depending on what category you fall in, of regulatory guidance. And specifically, this is what the page looks like, but we developed on this page is a link to a map to share information with everyone about where the regulatory protections for the bumblebee might be appropriate. We call these high potential zones. To get these, we used a model to identify areas where the bumblebee might be, starting with occurrence records from 2007 to 2016. We overlaid these occurrences with land cover information. We used a land cover model to identify barriers to dispersal, and based on this information and connectivity, based on this information, we identified these high potential zones. So for example, in this picture, the green triangle might be an occurrence record, and then that red polygon around it is what we've identified as the high potential zone. So what the high potential zone means then is, following the guidance that's also up on our website, these are the zones where regulation might be appropriate, and whether or not it's appropriate depends on whether there's suitable habitat for the bumblebee within this polygon, which is the next step in this kind of the sequence of determining whether a permit might be needed. So, for example, the bumblebees don't, because they use areas, open areas with nectar sources, they're not going to be using paved areas and flooded areas and crop fields and woodlands that are covered with buckthorn, so there's no spring ephemeral. So those kinds of areas, even if they're within that high potential zone polygon, are not going to be regulated because they're not rusty-patched bumblebee habitat. Something I'd like to show on this map is, it's really interesting if you look at where the bumblebees are, and again, this is really scaled up big, but you can see in this picture Minneapolis and Madison and the Collier counties of the Chicago area, and down in Springfield is a lot of where we have the remaining occurrences. So this is a very urban bumblebee, and there's something about urban and suburban habitats that's really providing a refuge for this species. We're working on conservation guidance specific to the bumblebee right now. We currently recommend Xerxes Society has some good conservation guidance up on their website. There's just some measures that are good for bumblebee species in general, land management with consideration for bumblebee life history, including things like doing burns with some refugia and small patches, addressing pesticide use to minimize that where you can, minimizing the release of commercial bumblebees into the wild, and again, this is because of the potential for pathogen transmission, and minimizing competition from non-native honeybees. So trying to, in areas where we know the rusty-patched bumblebee exists, we discourage establishment of new honeybee colonies as a potential concern for the butterfly, for the bumblebee. So I'll pause there and see if we have any questions about the rusty-patched bumblebee. Yes.
I just wanted to note that you said it was an urban and suburban bee, and if you look at the occurrence locations, you find that they're in very much suburban areas that are lacking any kind of native or natural, what we typically think of as natural habitat. So how do we reconcile that? What are the bees living on?
Well, that's a good question, and I was maybe a little overbroad. They're actually found, right where they're found is general natural areas, high-quality prairies. We've got some in our Chicago area here on some of our managed, large managed natural lands, but they're lands that are surrounded by urban and suburban. So where the bumblebees actually are high-quality habitats. Though there have been some sightings, I've been looking at the bee spotter map, and occasionally they're seen in some yards near there. But they're using good remnant natural habitats that are located in a matrix of urban and suburban, rather than good remnant natural habitats located in a matrix of agriculture. Anybody else?
Okay. Any general questions for Louise? Oh, behind me. Oh, sorry. Sorry.
In those prairie areas where they're normally found, is there a typical size or acreage that's required to support them, or could it be a small, high-quality 5-acre prairie? Or are they typically larger, 20, 30, 100-acre sites?
You know, Brian, the sites I know of are larger, but I haven't done a survey of all the sites, and so that's a great question, but I don't know what the smallest site is yet. That's something we'll probably be looking into with given that the species is just listed, our next step will be starting our recovery planning process, and that's a great piece of information that we'll be looking at.
There you go. So Monarch is a candidate. Rusty Patch is just listed. Are there other pollinators that are at risk that might be considered, I don't want to say candidate, but might be considered down the road, or that are on the radar right now?
Well, we have some other listed butterflies already, and of course they're pollinators too,
Right.
but there's no other candidates that I'm familiar with that
Okay.
I know of.
Louise, I'll ask a question. This is me back here. Can you talk a little bit more about the programmatic CCAA and what type of information, like specifically you'd be looking for input from rights-of-way organizations on?
Yeah, so to do a programmatic CCA of any kind, one of the places that we'd start is identifying what would be the activities that the entity would want covered. So we'd start with what is if it was railroads, for example. We'd say, okay, if they're going to put in pollinator habitat along railroads and they want to do a CCAA, what are the kinds of activities you might do on a routine basis, such as, vegetation management, that once you had monarch butterflies there, could take some monarch butterflies in the course of doing the work that you would need coverage for. And so we'd work with the industry or the agency or the property owner, whatever the category would be. But if it's programmatic, it would be the industry to say, what are the general kinds of activities that happen? What are the subparts of those activities? And then we'd look at how might those impact the butterfly? What are measures? Are there different? Are there alternatives to those activities that you could do that would still meet your need without impacting the species? If there aren't, are there ways to minimize it? If not, that's what we're left with, and that would need to be authorized by the permit. So what's the other good stuff that could be done to balance the impacts of that activity? And we'd come up with a list of, well, if you're a railroad right away and you have this kind of equipment and these kinds of programs, here's a suite of conservation activities that you could do, and that might be different than the kinds of activities that utility might do. So we'd list those out and start pulling together kind of a menu of things that then an individual railroad that wanted to become included under that CCAA could run through and say, well, I'm going to do these seven out of the 10 activities, so these apply to me, and I can do these 3 of these 4 conservation measures. So what we'd start doing is developing kind of a menu of what are the activities that would need to be covered, what are the conservation measures, best management practices that the industry could do to offset their actions. What's the voluntary stuff? What tools do they have to just provide that they might not have done as a course of their ordinary doing business, but for the purpose of the agreement, they would add in what are those conservation actions. And so collecting that suite of things is what we would do. Brian again.
On the subject of CCAs, is it possible or doing multiple species? So say, for instance, a monarch were to be formally listed, could you do a CCAA for monarch and rusty patch or any other potential pollinators that may come up?
So the answer is yes, you could do a CCAA for multiple species. Just no to the rusty patch because it's already a listed species. So CCAAs are for species that aren't listed. So the rusty patch would be a safe harbor, for example. But you could include other species. They don't even have to be candidate species. You could include them under the CCAA if you wanted to.
Sorry.
Oh, good. There you go.
For the CCAA on an industry basis, who would be the primary permit holder for something like that, for railroads, for example?
That's a great question. It can vary. So we have different examples. I mentioned in Wisconsin, the Carter Blue Butterfly statewide HCP. So that was, the state was the permit holder for the programmatic. It's an HCP, which is a little bit different, but the mechanism would be the same. The state was the primary permit holder, and then they worked with the forest industry. They worked with transportation, so they worked across sectors. In another example, we have an association of wind energy that's like an industry group that's been working with us to do, again, this is a programmatic HCP, not CCAA, but it kind of works the same way, that they would do something that then different wind farms could choose that they want to be covered under that and sign up under that. So there's a couple different options for that. And the key is that what we would really need is an entity that would be willing to take on the work, that for either a state agency or an industry association that would take on the work of being the permit holder for the benefit of their their whatever the constituents or members who would be covered under it. So it could go a couple different ways. The microphone is going to the gentleman in the back. Oh.
Hi, Louise. Whoa.
I can't track two microphones at once.
I'm still getting over being applauded as a federal employee, but hopefully a softball question. If a railroad company or a consortium of railroad companies wants to pursue a potential CCAA on monarchs or a group of pollinators, who would they call?
They would call the Fish and Wildlife Service in response to...
What's our phone number?
In response to the question from the gentleman from the Fish and Wildlife Service. Yeah, please, I mean, if you're in the room today and you're thinking about this, let me know. Because the truth is you can start with any one of us, and if we're not the right place, we'll get you to the right place. So let's move on. I think we've got one more. I'm checking out of the corner of my eye at the time, but the gentleman with the microphone.
Right now, we're already working with Fish and Wildlife to do a HCP. So would it be beneficial for us to also do one of these conservation plans with some of our landowners for the monarch butterfly or different types of pollinators in addition to that, or does the HCP cover both?
You should talk with your field office or your entity that you're working with, because I think there's a lot of ifs. It depends on what sorts of activities and the other covered species, but if you're already working on an HCP, my guess is that would be the most efficient way to go, is to talk with them about whether or not you can wrap it into that process. You might, an HCP, there might be some differences in the assurances you get compared to CCAAs, but that may be negligible for you given the workload savings, so definitely bring that up with the folks you're working on the HCP with. Okay, I think maybe one last question, if there is one. I see one way in the back there. Okay.
What is the timeline for a potential programmatic CCAA for the monarch with the listing, decision in 2019? How long does it usually take to get a CCAA in place?
Well, that's a great question, and it really, the time it takes to get it in place really varies with the scale and complexity of the CCAA. I've done them for a single property with the DNR, which didn't take that long. We also recently issued a CCA permit right before the listing of the eastern Massasauga rattlesnake to the state of Michigan, and they worked on that for years because they were trying to cover all their properties and a lot of different kinds of activities, and working with their, going back to their, it was a programmatic, so they were going back to their different subgroups. So the timeline can really vary based on the complexity. What the timeline needs to meet is that for us, a CCAA is a permit, and so it has to go into the Federal Register and provide an opportunity for public comment. So the deadline to get it done wouldn't be June of 2019 because it has to go through the Federal Register. So it would have to be done a little before then. So I'd say we still have time, but it definitely, if we're going to do one, it'd be good to start working on them now. Well, I think it's a WIA. Now, I'm not, Tom knows probably better than me. I haven't been, it's a WIA, right, okay.
Okay, thanks.
Just a quick question. The Rusty Patch, how much effort is underway currently for creating more habitat, and is that only occurring in the sort of red dot areas, or is that kind of anywhere?
Well, it's new, so I would say in terms of effort going on to create habitat for it, there's probably a lot of efforts that weren't intended specifically to benefit the Rusty Patch, but just prairie restoration, and actually a lot of the work for monarchs is likely to benefit the Rusty Patch bumblebee because they have such similar needs. So I think there's a lot of work going on that will benefit it, but given that it's so newly listed and it happened so fast, I don't think there's a lot of efforts yet specifically identified for the Rusty Patched. But I think I missed part of your question there. Okay.
Well, and whether that's contained to the areas where
Right, whether or not it would be best. I think right now, in terms of just initial recovery planning thoughts that I've heard, it does seem to make sense to try to build more habitat around the locations where we have them, because that we don't know exactly what that's telling us, except that they're hanging on there. So we target those areas, but we don't know everything of why that is. But it definitely seems that they're doing better in places where they're kind of buffered from agriculture and within this suburban matrix.
Got another one for you.
Can you have 3? I think you're almost at your limit.
So with respect to habitat, and it might be a little early in the process to be able to say, or the review process, but is newly restored areas, so say a mitigation site, a wetland mitigation site or something like that, is that viable habitat, do you know, or are they more kind of well-established areas that have a higher FQI or something along those lines?
I don't know the answer to that. I think mostly where we found them, they've been in high-quality areas, but I don't know whether that's really because the high quality is needed by the bumblebee, or those are the kind of sites that are getting the kind of detailed surveys where people actually know how to identify bumblebees, and they're identifying them. So that's, again, we're going to have to look into that with, that's going to be a key question for recovery planning is how can they use new restorations? Okay, Iris is giving me one last question.
I was just going to ask, how valuable are these citizen science efforts like Bee Spotter or something like that, where you take a picture of a bumblebee?
Super. They're super valuable. Yeah, they're definitely valuable. And Bee Spotter is great. We've gotten a couple of our, because especially, some species lend themselves better or worse to being identified by photographs, but a good photograph of the rusty